So Anthony is going to trace for us the ethical and moral background to the Act. So welcome, Anthony.
Thank you, and good afternoon. As Leslie said, I'm Anthony Millroy, PhD student at the University of the Sunshine Coast, under the supervision of Drs. Amy Clark, Shannon Brinker, and Professor Patrick Nunn. I'm here today to give an initial outline of my PhD research to date into the transformation and mutation of the themes and ideologies of Queensland's peculiar colonialism. But first, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their old people, and add that these lands were never ceded nor granted. My thesis is titled From Flinders to Federation, The Beautiful Lies of Queensland's Colonial Dreaming. And yes, there's clues in the title. From Flinders to Federation gives the timeline of the period being examined, while Dreaming introduces the Aboriginal people's concept of creation stories and refers to a past that lives still. And The Beautiful Lies are a nod to a literary hero and keen observer of the human condition. This is a history of ideas and ideologies, not of events. The events demonstrate the evolution of those ideas. So Mark Twain visited Australia in 1895 and observed that Australian history does not read like history, but like the most beautiful lies. And all of a fresh new sort, no mouldy old stale ones. It's full of surprises and adventures and incongruities and contradictions and incredibilities, but they're all true. They all happened. What he was referring to there is the false narratives of colonisation that were coming into question even in 1895. Interestingly, Twain's also credited with the saying that history does not repeat, but it certainly does rhyme. And we're going to see in Queensland's 19th century, though, the ancient rhymes of empire coming back and back and back, time and again. So in my undergraduate final year, I had the honour, shall I say, of attending a course in Indigenous history by Professor David Hollingsworth. And when we were studying the Aboriginal Protection, Restriction of Supply of Sale of Opium Act, the question that would not go away was, what on earth were they thinking? Where did these ideas come from? What made this morally, ethically, and importantly, socially acceptable? Well, Well, Professor Hollingworth replied, well, there's a PhD in that. So 6 years later, here we are. Before we move on, though, we need to define what it is that we're talking about. Colonialism is a changeable descriptor and has many interpretations. A few key thinkers. Curtin described it as a domination of people of another culture, whereas Veracini, who is a key thinker in this thesis, describes it as an unequal relationship predicated on displacement and violence being the key. The metropole and the colony are separated by a body of water. So what sort of colonialism? There's a number of different sorts. France, to a certain extent, certainly Germany and the Spanish practice a form of extractive or exploitative colonialism in places like the Congo and the Philippines, where the object was to go in, take the loot and go home again, basically. Whereas here in Australia, the British practice what is known as settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is where resident colonies are established away from the metropole. And it aims to extinguish itself as a relationship, to exterminate Indigenous political autonomy, if not the populations themselves, until there is no relationship. So my research has identified 4, shall we call them, themes, still struggling for the right word there, that have developed from the accepted British ideologies that began right back in the 12th century. They all mutated or changed somewhat over the 19th century, to accommodate new knowledge, new experiences. The first and most resilient was what I call the facade of incomprehension. Now, this had a few iterations and rationales over the century and encompassed what I also call Historia Nullius and Bill Stanner's silence. And the twin tyrannies of time and distance were the age-old constraints that were ever present and useful tools in the colonisation of Queensland. So I've got to get used to Windows. So the facade of incomprehension. Inga Clendenning makes note early in her book Dancing with Strangers of W.E.J. Stanner's comment that all the troubles visited upon the Aboriginal people since 1788 could be attributed to the inability of the British to even begin to comprehend their ways, their worldview, their very existence. The false narratives, animosity, and blind white eye that endures to the present day had its roots in the conscious choice of not comprehending those early entanglements. It is this thesis' contention that this was a willful conscious choice, not to comprehend. So this facade of incomprehension is an encompassing term that describes the colonists' shifting understanding of the Aboriginal people's ontologies and epistemologies. This facade evolved and mutated over the century through the resultant themes of Historia Nullius and Stanner's silence. It is argued here that the dominant coloniser attitude towards Aboriginal people shifted from early fearful coexistence through indifference and exasperation to aggressive animosity and on to finally a sheen of benign paternalism, overlaid with what George Bush described as the soft bigotry of low expectations. In other words, once the Aboriginal people lost their authenticity in the eyes of the whites, they became an irritant, and then a problem, and finally an embarrassment, all within 4 fast generations. So, Historia Nullius, we all know what terra nullius is. So the understanding and application of that legalistic term terra nullius, land belonging to no one, is accepted as a foundational rationale of Australian colonialism. Never mind that the term did not appear in any legal documents in Australia, at least until about 1920, and then in relation to the polar regions, particularly Antarctica. The colonists had other handy terminology to describe what we call terra nullius. And it was a hollow excuse and instantly debatable, because obviously there were people living here when the colonists arrived. And although mentioned by Veracini in his 2007 paper, Historylessness, Australia as a Settler Colonial Collective, this thesis expands on this concept and argues that Historia Nullius was the rationale of terra nullius. Unlike the other lands that the British and other people had colonised, there were to the British eye no recognisable traces of established civilisation. There were no colosseums, there were no broken statues. There was no, to their eye, formal forms of agriculture. So, imbued with the Lockean ideals of the creation of private property, the colonisers, there was no evidence of long-run civilisation, to their mind. And without that visible palimpsest, the Aboriginal people could have no claim to the land. No civilisation means you haven't been here, so it's not yours. And then even when the early explorers saw agricultural fields and rock art, it was dismissed as inconsequential And I found one reference from 1813 where a British magistrate when describing rock art, came to the conclusion that it had to be the Egyptians that did it. It couldn't possibly have been the Aboriginal. So a key trope of civilization throughout history is the civilizing process, or the civilizing mission. To bring civilization and God to the heathen until there are no heathens left. The twin tyrannies, well, Geoffrey Blainey articulated half of this in his 1966 book, The Tyranny of Distance, claiming that distance is as characteristic of Australia as mountains are of Switzerland. Essentially, it's how far away the colonists and Australians were from both the metropole, the frontier, each other, how long it took for a message to travel between them. On board ship, the tyranny was an accepted passenger and was the metronome of daily life. And we have evidence of, well, it took them 9 months to get here in the first fleet. So this thesis will argue that whilst distance was an obstacle that would be mitigated by the technology of the rapidly accelerating Industrial Revolution, what Zygmunt Bauman called heavy modernity, the ontological understanding of time itself was so very different between the colonisers and the colonised as to be an impossibility for each other to understand. The colonisers' linear time view, couched as progress, onward and upward to a Judeo-Christian reckoning, stood in stark contrast to the Aboriginal understanding of time as almost a rhythmic chant of events-based sequence. The imposition of calendars, clocks, of deadlines and straight lines upturned the Aboriginal way of life. So as incomprehension turned to disdain, when in white eyes the Aboriginal people lost their authenticity, this created willful animosity. Henry Reynolds maintains that this happened when the Aboriginal people put on trousers. This theme was first coined by Stanner in his 1968 Boyer Lectures of the Great Australian Silence, the Cult of Forgetfulness, and developed by Timothy Bottens in his 2007 book, The Conspiracy of Silence. This term, the silence, describes how, when and why pervasive silence was imposed on the discussion of any and all aspects of first Australians, their very existence, their culture, and more importantly, the maltreatment, regardless of the evidence and the humanitarian cries for justice that have echoed down the years from the early 19th century until Stanner's lifting of the veil in 68. Code words were coined for the murders: dispersal, stag hunting, other euphemisms. Blind eyes were turned and the language describing the first Australians veered to the purgative by the tumultuous 1830s, soon after the infamous Mile Creek murders, and for here the Kilcoy massacre. For 100 years, we did not speak of our forebearers' actions. So, where do these attitudes come from? They were not freshly formed and static on arrival. Rather, they evolved over centuries, as we'll see, as they did here. And key influences over the centuries included, but are not limited to, internal and external colonisation within what became Britain, the Enlightenment, the enclosures and Highland clearances, the union of Scotland and England, the Industrial Revolution, and changing understanding and importance of time itself. They all came together in the form of British exceptionalism, and my research has taken me back to the 12th century and the colonisation of Wales, where the same words were used to describe the Welsh as were used to describe Aboriginal people. Barbarians, heathens, primitive, etc., etc. Exactly the same words. So now we'll start to unpack some of those origins. As mentioned before, the civilising mission trope reappears right throughout this history regardless of the country in question. So, starting with the invasion and colonisation of Wales and Ireland, underway by the 12th century, John Gillingham, 1992, notes in his article, The Beginnings of English Imperialism, that by the early 12th century, profound economic, social, military and cultural developments had so transformed England as to mean that the English and Celtic worlds were now sufficiently far apart for the difference, for the differences to be visible to contemporaries, notably William of Malmesbury, the first to articulate this significant otherness in terms of the classical contrast between civilization and barbarism. The other is an important concept here. There can be no us without an other. And so evolving concepts of European Christianity saw most of the great powers of the 18th century proclaiming that their contests were civilising missions, bringing God to heathens, saving souls. And Jones in 1971 comments that Christianity, like Stoicism, was a cosmopolitanism, offering a fellowship in a religious commonwealth which ignored the old boundaries of polis, nation, class or tribe. If it could be called God's work, then it couldn't be immoral. So these terms, civilization, barbarism, they're crucial descriptors that turn up again and again and again. Gillingham notes that for the English to construe the brutality of conquest and or the rapacity of commerce as a civilising mission, and he quotes Corrigan and Sayer, took a national culture of extraordinary self-confidence and moral rectitude. The civilising mission trope, characterised by understanding John Stuart Mill's principles of liberty, applying only to civilised people, reappears throughout Britain's colonising epoch and is a central motive of Queensland, indeed Australian colonising project, and underpins the theme of Historia Nullius. That is, without history there is no civilisation and therefore no tenure, reinforcing the facade of incomprehension, and only white people could be deemed to be civilised. We see this wherever the British went. So the great chain of being, some of you may have heard of this, was a perceived linear progression from inanimate objects through plants, animals, humans and angels to God. It was very detailed and structured with societies throughout history, describing constant superiority to humans who were subservient to God alone, and was the rationale that British exceptionalism endorsed and promoted. It was proclaimed in schools and churches and courts, and validated social institutions, was amplified by everyday experience. English social orders of the 17th, 18th and 19th century typically depict a hierarchy informed by this great chain of being, with a king preeminent, followed by high nobility, then down through gentry, yeomen, labourers and paupers. Indigenous peoples of the conquered lands were the lowliest of creatures in this great chain. But even in the 19th century, the colonising projects had to be couched in terms of bringing God to heathens to give their mission a social licence. And it's best exemplified by Cecil Rhodes in 1895. I'll let you read that. Couldn't put it, I have no words for that. So, one key societal driver in the 18th century is what's become known as the Enlightenment. John Gascoigne claims that Manning Clark saw the Enlightenment as one of the quarrelling godparents contesting the infant colony's soul. Perhaps more fittingly, Jan Kosiambis in the Oxford History of Australia portrays the Enlightenment as a tool, giving hegemonic power to the elite bourgeoisie and saying it was as if European settlement in Australia was born modern, and the world which the colonists made was new and brightly lit. In Europe, the Enlightenment resulted in the reinforcement of religious dogma with scientific research, coupled with a blossoming of art, philosophy, general inquiry into fixed certainties. And this empowered a religious zeal to scientific study and underpinned concepts such as the aforementioned Great Chain of Being and British Manifest Destiny. Progress, invention and the spread of colonisation, and by extent Euro-civilisation, were now godly pursuits, cloaking mercantile opportunism. Three key thinkers influenced Australian thought in the colonisation project. They were John Locke, David Hume and Bentham, amongst others. Locke was perhaps the most influential. According to Bertrand Russell, must be treated as the founder of philosophical liberalism, as much as of empiricism in theory of knowledge, and is credited with the first comprehensive statement of the liberal philosophy. Eric Hobsbawm, on the other hand, was a bit more scathing. He described him as philosophically feeble and a favourite thinker of vulgar liberalism, yin and yang. The term liberalism probably needs a little definition here. Liberalism is an amorphous concept that's mutated to suit the epistemological needs of philosophers and politicians, and now can be used as praise or abuse. For Iverson, liberalism has no essence, but it does have a history, and he defines four broad tendencies that are associated with it, and these played out here in Australia. The broad commitment to individual and social freedom, to toleration, to individualism and autonomy, to a suspicion of unlimited or discretionary powers. These became quite key principles in Australian colonial history. So Locke's ideals of money, property and the government allowed for and rewarded with status for promoting laissez-faire accumulation of wealth. And Lockean liberalism was appealing to the colonisers because it empowered them as much as was possible at the time. This proto-individualism, combined with the safety and certainties of empire, gave hope to the masses that they too could prosper in the Antipodes by dint of work and focus, and there they could throw off the chains of class and patronage that were so stultifying in Britain. They were encouraged to take the land. David Hume, most interesting man. Scotland was the first Enlightenment centre to study what Hume called the science of man. This is the first modern attempt to study ideas and beliefs and how humans process that information. The belief that this would give insight into God and the self and make rational the principles of morality, justice, philosophy and politics, all in an attempt to demonstrate how ordinary people could lead a virtuous life in a rapidly changing and complex world of heavy modernity. It is here that we get one of the first inklings of the omnipotent theme of progress, which was to become a foundational motive in the colonisation of Queensland and Australia. In any history of Queensland, you will hear that term progress, progress, progress. Hume believed history was a process by which changing property expectations, as well as the struggle for power and the preservation of constitutional liberties, shaped the nation's progress from a state of rudeness to one of refinement. For the British, for the colonisers, Australia was definitely rude. And Jeremy Bentham had a profound impact on Australian society. He was a vehement opponent of transportation. Although now from a distance of 200 years, identifying his legacy has become a bit blurry as it's blended with other key ideologies that have formed the Australian political system, those of Chartism and socialism. It is fair to say that Benthamism paved the way for an Australian form of socialist action by the turn of the 20th century. And it has been said that Australia was a Benthamite society by the time of Parkes's education reforms in the 1850s. David Llewellyn argues that the most useful way to understand the Benthamite influence is through the lens of Gould's 2007 concept of entangled histories, the interconnection of countries, region, people and ideas. Australia, Great Britain, New Zealand, the United States of America are all entangled in Benthamite history. Australia exemplified what was possible and what was to be avoided. Hugh Collins in 1985 claims Bentham's principles of utilitarianism, legalism and his positivism have come to define the Australian political ethos. His egalitarian principle is of the greatest good for the greatest number was clearly democratic, though the colonists certainly did not count the Aboriginal people in the greatest number. They were the sacrificial lamb for the greater good. Henry Reynolds, 2018, makes the case that Bentham's criticism of the founding of the penal colony described an incurable, enduring, fatal flaw in that there had been no negotiated treaty with the Aboriginal people. Central Asian England in the 1690s, and this had been going on in limited ways from about the 14th century, was the enclosures of common land, with the earliest types of enclosure being the wasteland reclamation and the combining of open field sallions, removing lands from customary law and cancelling common tenancies and common rights. The term wasteland is, its etymology is medieval English and refers to unploughed lands including forests, marshes and other vacant resources. This term wasteland has been a common descriptor in Queensland well into the 1980s. Patrick Wolfe coins the term primitive accumulation, whereby native flora and fauna become a dwindling resource as commercial pastoralism and agriculture takes control of wasteland. This was the case in Britain in the 1690s and 1700s. And Indigenous people are thereby further marginalised. This was the case during the enclosures and was echoed in colonial Queensland centuries later. Land had become property or capital and was no longer just a measure of status or even sustenance, but of wealth in particular. There's that rhyme again. Oops. So time. Particular importance to the colonisation of Australia, two key time-related developments that enabled accurate maritime charting and mapping and division of land. Proved to have a significant effect on both coloniser and colonised. They were consistent calendars and longitude. Perhaps the most significant was temporal. The passing of the days and seasons have been measured in similar ways by different societies right throughout recorded history. And in most cases was tied to religious observation and events and ordered by solar and lunar phases in the passing of the seasons. In Western Christian culture, calendars had been adjusted and adapted as early as, well, notably as early as 45 BC, when the Julian calendar replaced the Roman calendar. The Council of Nicaea established Easter Sunday as the vernal equinox in 325. However, by the 16th century, the equinox and Easter Sunday were out of sync with solar events by 10 days, thereby creating a serious religious conundrum. If God ordered the heavens and had sent his Son to redeem souls, then why were the heavens not obeying? So, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar to Rome and surrounding Catholic countries in 1582. But it wasn't until 1752 that ever obdurate Britain adopted it and thereby joined synchronised European time as the dominant scientific and social temporal measurement. And Britain lost 11 days as a result. There were riots, where people demanding pay for those 11 days. So this act entrenched the concept of the linear nature of Euro time. And this time framing would become a key disjunction of understanding between colonised and coloniser. And a key feature of the facade of incomprehension and obviously the twin tyrannies. However, longitude, the north-south positioning, as opposed to latitude, was fiendishly difficult to determine with any accuracy. A difference of 1 hour is the equivalent of 15 degrees of longitude, but telling position was almost impossible. So after a series of disastrous shipwrecks in 1714, the British government offered an enormous prize of £20,000. It took a very long time, but it was John Harrison who finally perfected an accurate chronometer that could deal with the Pacific issues of seaborne use and had it tested by Captain James Cook on his second voyage. By having one watch set at Greenwich time and a second set at local time, as determined by a noon measurement, position could be established. For early Australia, in its rush to categorise, define, measure, it meant that they'd be able to draw straight lines on maps. Mightn't sound like much, but it's an important thing, particularly when we move to people like Wakefield. Those maps and charts then became legal documents proving possession. It was no longer from that hill to that valley. It was from this line to that line. And so distance had been accurately defined, and the twin tyrannies of time and distance, although still dominant force, were separated from the vagaries of imprecision. So, this is a précis. It's hard to put 4 years' work into 30 minutes, but give it a go. It's an overview of how and why the foundational evolving ideologies of Queensland and Australian colonisation were formed, and the role of British historical events in shaping them. Time did not allow us to examine the Union of 1707, the Industrial Revolution, the preparation and selection of sites for convict settlement, nor the influence and control of the Scots. What we have seen is what my supervisors have reviewed and approved to this point. By this time next year, we'll be able to see how these ideologies played out in Queensland over the 19th century. I can say now that Queensland's 19th century played out in two acts. 1800 to 1859, the era of colonial government, distant colonial government, and 1859 to 1900, the era of settler government. In both eras, the Scots and pastoralists were the shapers and standard bearers of these themes. Henry Reynolds, it's interesting to note that Henry Reynolds' observation that Queensland historiography down to the 1900s in particular, 1990s in particular, was one of the battle with the land rather than the battle for the land. So if anyone here has some information, events, times, relatives, of how this played out in colonial Queensland, I would be most grateful. I'll leave you with a quote from Tom Griffith's book, The Art of Time Travel, where he discusses Judith Wright's Cry for the Dead. An old pastoralist wrote to Judith Wright, and he said, "The odd thing is, you know, that we always knew the theme in our bones, as only children can. Those legendary unspoken horrors, those sins cherished by successive generations, were essential to us. They added value to our conspiracy of silence, our annual dues at the Bushman's Club. We suffered much from a simpleton's concept of loyalty, lived our lives at very exalted levels of guilt and fear. Ours was, I suppose, an odd inheritance, the preservation in silence of truths suppressed by our elders and betters, those old pastoral nomads who in their way did have something to hide. We valued that legacy rightly. Without it, we might have seen ourselves for what we were, dusty industrialists masquerading as bushmen." So thank you. Questions?